Hi, it's time for another verb of the day. Today's verb is moan, and this verb was suggested by the viewer Luis. Luis, I'm so grateful for you and your many wonderful suggestions. Now, let's take a moment and review some of the definitions or the ways that we can use this verb. The first way you might encounter moan can mean to make a long, low sound that might be expressing either suffering, you might think of pain, or sometimes it's used with pleasure. As I thought of this particular verb, I thought about a particular cooking show that I really enjoy. There's this woman named Patty. She makes wonderful dishes. And usually at the end of the show, as she's tasting her food, she goes, mmm, right? So that's that kind of sound that we might be talking about as it relates to pleasure. But as far as pain, this might occur as someone has had an injury, but again, the sound seems to last. It's not a quick, short type of thing, but it's long. A second way moan gets used can mean for an object to make a sound that resembles the one we were talking about in the first definition. So something that resembles that long sound, and generally, again, a bit lower pitched. So sometimes people will talk about the wind moaning or causing that sound. Other times it might be a machine of some kind. A third way the verb moan gets used can mean to complain or grumble. Typically, this is about something that's rather minor. So, not a serious matter, but just kind of, oh, I can't believe this thing is happening, or the way that it's happening, etc. We'll look at some examples of that a little later. For now, you should know that moan is a regular verb. If you want to make the progressive form of this verb, all you need to do is add ing, and that forms moaning. The past tense and the participle form of our verb can be made by adding ed. Our base verb, moan, ends in a voiced end sound. This means our ed ending is just going to make a d sound, and we're not going to add an extra syllable when we say it. The past tense and participle form of the verb should sound like this: moaned, moaned. Now, there are a few phrasal verbs that we can discuss and look at examples of how they're being used. The first phrasal verb you might encounter is to moan about. This is going to go back to that third definition. So, someone is complaining, they're grumbling, they're griping about something, and usually it keeps going on. So, it's not just one comment, one act of complaining, but it tends to be ongoing. So, an example of this: do teenagers moan about everything? Okay. I don't know if you've ever lived with one, but in my experience, there is very frequent complaining and grumbling about every little thing. So I might say it does feel like many, probably not all, but many do moan about everything. Another phrasal verb you might encounter is to moan out. This can have a couple different meanings. One way to use it is to talk about uttering a loud and prolonged, long, low sound. So, an example of this: injured soldiers were moaning out on the battlefield. Okay, so think about that first definition, the long, low sounds due to suffering, right? So here, right, they have been injured. We don't know in what way or how severe, but you can hear these kind of, oh, like sounds of pain. A second way to use moan out could mean to utter something in a low, guttural, droning voice. So here, someone is trying to speak, but it's not very clear, and you'll see that, I think, a bit here in the example. The injured passenger moaned out his name just before he passed out, right? So, not a normal speaking voice, and again, this tends to be done in rather extreme circumstances. Another phrasal verb you might encounter is to moan with. This could mean to utter loud, long, prolonged moans due to intense sensation or some type of stimulus. So again, we can kind of go to the two extremes of suffering or pleasure. So an example of this: 7 months into her pregnancy, my wife moaned with pain throughout the night. Okay, so again, perhaps if you have had the experience of carrying a child, you might be able to understand or sympathize what this particular person was experiencing. This person's partner, maybe spouse here, is describing how these long sounds kind of continued throughout the night due to physical pain and discomfort associated with the pregnancy. Now, let's take a look at some more examples with moaning. Today, I thought we could practice the past progressive and the present progressive. Let's start with the past progressive. Many teachers, textbooks, and even other YouTube videos will call this the past continuous, and that is perfectly okay. Either term is referring to actions that were ongoing or actions that were continuing during a time period in the past. The reason I like saying past progressive is you can see two P's, and that can help you remember you will need two parts to make your verb. We're going to be using a past form of be, and there are two forms of that in the past tense, so we must pay attention to our subject. If the subject is I, he, she, or it, you're going to use was, that's your first part, and then the ing form of the verb. But if your subject is you, we, or they, use were, W-E-R-E, and then the ing form of the verb. Let's take a look at a positive or affirmative example here. She was moaning and doubled over, so the lifeguard jumped in to rescue the swimmer. So I'm probably leaving the word water out there. So the lifeguard jumped into the water to rescue the swimmer is probably what I meant there. So apologies for the error. But again, we can imagine someone is in pain. I saw a sentence very similar to this as someone was telling the story of having a heart attack while exercising in the water. And so all of those sounds alerted the lifeguard that there was a problem. If you want to make a negative past progressive sentence, again, pay attention to your subject, then use was or were, followed by not, and then the ing form of the verb. Sometimes was not will be combined into the contraction wasn't, and sometimes were not will be combined into the contraction weren't. You can see that in my example here. They weren't moaning in pain after ascending the mountain. So here, this was not an ongoing action or not an action that was continuing. Now, let's take a look at making a yes or no question in the past progressive. To do this, start with was or were. Whatever form matches your subject, that subject comes next. Then use the ing form of the verb. Here's another example. Was he moaning and complaining all through the meeting? Here, you can probably tell this is going to go back to that third definition where we're talking about kind of grumbling. You'll hear whining and moaning and complaining, sometimes used to really emphasize just how much this action is ongoing. Now let's move on and look at some sentences in the present progressive. Again, you might hear this referred to as the present continuous, and that's just fine. It means exactly the same thing. We use this verb tense to talk about actions that are happening now. We also use it to discuss actions that are in progress during a time period that has not yet been completed. Now, again, present progressive, you'll see two P's, and again, we're going to need two parts to make our verb. We will be using a present form of be, and this means we've got to pay attention to our subject because that form of be will change. We have three forms of be in the present. If your subject is I, you will want to use am, and then the ing form of the verb. If your subject is you, we, or they, use are, A-R-E, and then the ing form of the verb. Finally, if your subject is he, she, or it, use is, and then the ing form of the verb. Let's take a look at our first example here. Helicopter parents are moaning to schools every time their children have a bad day at school. Again, this is another real, authentic example I took from some reading I was doing. This phrase, helicopter parents, kind of like the idea is they hover over their children, making sure there are no problems, no issues, and just kind of always in control is one of the ideas there. So here, I believe it was a teacher who was writing about their observations. Now let's take a look at negative present progressive sentences. To do this, again, start with your subject, then use the form of be that matches, followed by not, and then the ing form of the verb. Here's another example. Everyone isn't moaning about the fast food chain's price increases. So again, that we're going back to the third definition of grumbling, complaining. Finally, let's take a look at making a yes or no question in the present progressive. To do that, start with your form of be, whichever form matches your subject, that subject comes next, then use the ing form of the verb. Here's another example. Is the wind moaning in the chimney? Right, so kind of making that long sound. Prolonged is a good word there. Now let's spend a moment looking at some words that are related to our verb moan. You can probably guess our first thing we'll discuss is just the noun form of this word. The noun moan has already been used a couple times in explaining the verb, but one way to use this noun moan is to refer to a long, low sound that is made by someone who is experiencing pain or pleasure. So, an example of this. The animal's moan sounded like one of despair. Okay, so here someone's kind of describing it. Sounds like this animal is in pain. It's been hurt. It might unfortunately not be with us longer. A second way to use moan is to refer to a complaint. And usually it's thought of something being rather trivial. So not super important, not very serious, and therefore it isn't taken very seriously by others. An example of this. There have been moans about the vending machine's contents. Okay? So you might think of different snack foods, drinks, and maybe we're in an environment where there are bigger problems going on. So these complaints seem very minor and not serious. Another word you might encounter is the noun moaner, and generally this is used to talk about someone who complains a lot. And the topic of their complaints is usually things that aren't so important to others. So this is generally not a good thing to be described as or to be called a moaner. So an example of this, that group of moaners will never be satisfied. This just means they're going to keep complaining, maybe no matter what we do or no matter what we decide. The last word I'll leave you with today is the adjective moanful. That suffix ful is always a good indication we have an adjective, and it means full of moaning. So we can go back to really any of those earlier definitions that we've looked at. So an example here. The moanful students reported getting less than 6.5 hours of sleep nightly. So this suggests a little bit that this particular group of students was complaining. Maybe it's like, we have so much homework, we have so much going on, we can't get enough sleep, right? Perhaps that's the context of that sentence. Again, I want to say a special thank you to Luis for suggesting today's verb. You all watching are always welcome to make suggestions for future videos as well. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.